Fuck, I don't have my main video planned for this month. I need more time for all the stuff I have on my schedule. Quick, I know, I'll talk about a game I've already played that I know isn't too painfully long. Armored Core. Maybe I should just go for the one I love. Right, I had the idea of doing a video on why you should play Nexus. Let's do that. So, are you a new Armored Core fan who came in with Armored Core 6 and don't know where to start to go back to the older games? Okay, that framing makes me feel like I should have done this sooner, honestly, but I'd like to humbly suggest that you should start with Armored Core Nexus. Which, granted, may be a little controversial to say. I feel like the first two third-gen games are generally better regarded by traditionalists, but there's a simple reason I say you should do Nexus first. Nexus is the first game in the series to have modern dual analog controls. And before the PS3 era Armored Core moved away from the classic mechanics entirely, only one more game would use this control scheme. If I were a lesser critic, I'd play that up, but okay, I'm going to be a bit mean here, but if you can't deal with an occasional wonky control scheme, I don't think you're that into retro games. It's just the price of entry of playing a game made before so much of 3D video games were figured out. And frankly, playing something from an era where things were less standardized and more creative. The modern dual analog setup didn't really become the standard until the 7th console generation. It was popularized during the 6th generation with Halo, sure, but it's also worth remembering that things take time to become standards, and that hindsight is 20/20, particularly when separating good and bad ideas. Hell, the 6th gen consoles were the first ones where every console had 2 analog sticks by default, and that's only because the Dreamcast didn't last. But the control scheme used by earlier Armored Core games does take some getting used to. It's basically tank controls on the D-pad with the shoulder buttons used to look up and down and to strafe left and right. You get used to it, but because there's already plenty of quirks to controlling the game even with dual analog controls, I found it easier to get used to piloting in Nexus and then go back to the older games and learn the old scheme. A good pilot can make an Armored Core dance, and I find it easier to learn that dance with a more approachable scheme, and then learn to repeat those steps with the older scheme. So that's why I think Nexus is the easiest place to start classic Armored Core games. But there's more than just approachability that makes Nexus worth playing. It's also the most realized version of the classic era of Armored Core, the first 3 generations, or everything on the PS1 and 2. While these games were fairly iterative, they were constantly improving through that iteration. Just to list the things that Nexus added, you got hanger cores that let you equip extra smaller weapons to use when your handheld weapons ran out of ammo, or to just allow you to drop the handheld weapons to change approaches mid-battle. And the game also added the tuning system, which in these games was a lot more about small upgrades and fine-tuning your Armored Core's performance rather than the straightforward unlocks and power boosts of Armored Core 6's tuning system. And this is on top of left-hand weapons besides laser blades and energy shields only having been added in the earlier 3rd gen games. Though there were also some rebalances that I think older players weren't as fond of. The radiator and heat systems were rebalanced to be a lot more of a concern. While they had been in 4 prior games, they were a system that could a little too easily be ignored. And some weapons had magazines now. Instead of just firing endlessly, after a certain number of rounds there would be a reload delay until you could shoot again. Personally, I think these changes do make the game more interesting rather than less, but well, From Software fans being very particular about the exact iteration of the series they like is a long-standing tradition, I guess. But regardless of some complaints over the last 2, it is the most complete with the most options for creating your Armored Core, which is a big reason I think it's a great place to start. Experience the customization at its best, so there's no doubt on whether you like it or not. But there is one exception: Human Plus and OP Intensify. In the early games, Human Plus was a sort of new game plus easy mode. If you ran too far into debt to prevent you from getting stuck, the game would restart the campaign, but now you have a new special power. Each time this happened, you would gain gain an additional ability up to a certain number of upgrades, and some of these were very powerful, most notably the ability to use cannon weapons with biped legs without having to enter a firing stance, and most famously the ability to fire a beam blade from your laser blade with a special input. In later games, Human Plus was removed, but OP Intensify was added to replace it, an option part only available after beating the game, which took up all your option part slots, but if you had it equipped while accomplishing certain tasks, you would add features to it, including pretty much all the old Human Plus functions. Unlocking these were cryptic, basically secrets, but I like it better as a cool post-game bonus power trip. However, Nexus was the first game not to make any of these available to players, well, except for the Laser Blade wave, which is now available on any Laser Blade from the very start if you hit the boost button after hitting the melee button. But it's kind of lame you don't get the other stuff. OPI was a fun thing to mess around with post-game, and it becomes annoying when you factor in that some enemy pilots would, and still do, have access to Human Plus and OPI abilities. I don't really think this is anything egregiously unfair as special boss abilities go, granted. I mean, most players in all the earlier games would have fought these bosses without these abilities anyway, but it's still just kind of not as fun if you can't get them yourself. But as for the combat gameplay, well, you may be wondering what makes classic Armored Core so special and why you should bother trying to get into it. I mean, it doesn't handle quite as smoothly as some of the newer games in the series, but like with classic Monster Hunter, I kind of see that as part of the appeal. You are piloting a vehicle after all, and a heavy one at that. Compared to later games, mobility is quite a bit more constrained because even just boosting along the ground consumes your energy. So without quick boost, this is where most of the energy management is. Running out of energy in these early games comes with a lengthy recharge period, but moving without boosting leaves you slow and vulnerable. The real highlight of this era of Armored Core, though, is the sheer amount of stuff you have at your command. At any given time, your Armored Core will have some of the following: a main hand weapon and up to 2 back-mounted weapons that you can cycle through on one button, with back-mounted weapons besides missiles requiring you to enter a static firing position unless you have tank or quad legs equipped. You can also equip a left-hand weapon, either an equivalent to many of the right-hand weapons, or specialized equipment like a shield or a laser blade. These left-hand weapons have their own button. If your core has the capacity, you can equip a pair of hanger weapons. Secondary weapons that are limited to smaller weapons that will automatically be equipped if you purge your handheld weapons, either because you ran out of ammo or just to switch to your hanger weapon if it's more useful for the situation. Although you have to be thoughtful about this because you cannot pick up a main weapon once you drop it. Your core can also come with an overbooster, which consumes a massive amount of energy and produces a ton of heat, but lets you move extremely quickly. Or your core may come with an Exceed Orbit, which are gun drones that automatically engage nearby targets while active, and you can equip interior and shoulder-mounted equipment pieces that tend to provide more secondary effects rather than being weapons you use to attack your opponent directly. And that's just the active stuff. There's a lot more things to consider for customization, down to stuff like the performance of your core's anti-missile system, or using a back-mounted radar versus a head part with one built in. So even if combat isn't quite as intense as 4th generation Armored Core or as technical as AC6, there is a tactical element to it that I think is where the fun resides. Viewing each encounter as a puzzle, a question that you need to find an answer to with the tools you have available. Fuck, I think I just doomed the chances of getting a lot of people to play this game, because that kind of approach to combat isn't really popular, even if I do think it tends to lead to very interesting gameplay. And then the highlight of Armored Core Nexus that gets a section all to itself is that it has 2 whole campaigns. Disc 1, Evolution, has one of my favorite Armored Core settings. Of course, it has that classic Armored Core vibe and pacing. You're not important, even like 621 was in AC6. 621 was a pawn, but of someone important. They were always going to be important or die. In Nexus, though, you're just a freshly minted mercenary, a raven. You're just in the wrong place at the wrong time, but very good at what you do. Maybe you can nudge events a certain way with the contracts you pick, but ultimately you're a scavenger. You can potentially do a lot of unethical things for money. But even if you still work for the corporations, you at least have a bit more freedom than a lot of the people in the world. It's a horrible world and you are just trying to survive it. I do feel like later AC games, including 6, become a bit less grounded, more focused on world-changing consequences than being a witness to a terrible cyberpunk dystopian world. Nexus in particular, though, is one of the more hopeless Armored Core games. You have less choice than normal. There's story reasons for this. You're just caught up in everything, trying to survive, and occasionally you pull the trigger on an important target. Nexus follows up Armored Core 3 and Silent Line, which were themselves a sort of semi-reboot of the original Armored Core timeline from the first 2 generations. By the time of Nexus, humanity is no longer confined to the underground cities, and several decades later are still gradually reclaiming the surface, still venturing into new areas and reclaiming lost technology of the old era. But eventually, as always, the corporations' greed overtakes them and war begins again. But in the end, the corporations are never quite as all-powerful as they think they are. The story is a bit detached even by Armored Core standards, and the ending does feel like it comes a bit out of nowhere. But there is a certain appeal in the Armored Core stories where you're halfway between the main character and just a bystander. The game is overall one of the smoother Armored Core experiences. Missions are varied and interesting, but rarely too challenging except for certain AC battles and missions you're meant to fail, though that could be the experience speaking. And the final boss fight is admittedly a bit frustrating, though the old games do generally have fewer frustrating boss enemies than Armored Core 6 would. It's otherwise a little difficult to talk about because, well, it's hard to talk about one of these older Armored Core games without just talking about all of them. Because Armored Core, and that includes 6, leans heavily on the fact that all of them have that sort of perfect combat and systems loop. One that admittedly is more common but also worse as live service games twist it from being fun to being a way to keep you playing and all that manipulative shit. I'm referring to that loop where you have a gameplay section and a customization section, and each gets you excited for the other. XCOM is pretty famous for nailing this. You do a mission and are aware of the potential improvements and earn more money, so you're excited to improve your AC or even build a new one. Then you spend 10-15 minutes in the garage poring over parts and stats until you have an even better build, which you're excited to try out and then repeat. 2 halves of the game that are both engaging in their own right, and each of which makes you want to play the other more. I guess I should mention that Evolution is also the last appearance of the lose a battle but continue the campaign mechanic, one that I never really liked. It's not really used that well, or at all. It basically just means you can coast along while failing until you end up a creek without a paddle, and then end up going human plus if the game has that feature. But I think the real problem here is that if you try an Iron Man Armored Core, it really ends up taking away more than it adds. A big part of Armored Core is using the right build for the job, either picking the right one that you have or customizing one just for the mission. Conversely, sometimes you just lose because your untested build isn't that great or you picked the wrong build for the mission. The games rarely give you the best information as to what you should prepare for. Plus, in many of the early games, this mechanic gets thrown out in the end game anyway. After a certain point, losing will send you back to the title screen and force you to load your last save. At least Armored Core Nexus does a little bit with it. There are a few missions in the early game that are pretty clearly designed as ones that you're intended to fail, but because of Armored Core's mechanics, these don't stick out too much, and it flows completely naturally when you can win them if you're good enough. It doesn't change the story, granted, but you do get some nice payouts. So that's kind of cool. Ironically, the next game, Last Raven, would remove the ability to continue after a failure. You could either retry the mission or restart the playthrough if you were stuck, but Last Raven is built around a shorter but highly replayable campaign. A given run will only be about a dozen missions, but there's so many mission choices that you could play the game several times and never do the same one twice. It would have been a great fit for this sort of thing. The game does try and discourage save scumming by having a save system that marks if you did a mid-game save or saved and quit, though all I noticed it affecting was a couple of times an arena battle changed after I lost and reset. Oh, and Evolution's map theme is just incredible. I mean, just take a listen, it always gets me excited. Right up there with shape memory alloys from the PS1 titles. And speaking of shape memory alloys, we have Revolution, one of the best bonus features any game has ever had. It comes on a second disc and contains 15 missions from the PS1 Armored Core games. But it's not just these missions. For each remastered mission, there's 2 more. One that is a direct sequel, and one that is an alternative, as if you'd been hired by the opposite side. Though 1 or 2 missions only have one or the other of these variants, this still gives you just over 40 additional missions, about the length of a whole additional Armored Core campaign. And while they're all isolated, I think they do hit one of the best parts of Armored Core: smaller short stories where you can choose a side and see your actions play out. Plus it's a way to get some more parts, including some that are first available here, like the parts to recreate Stinger's AC Vixen from Project Phantasma. Revolution is just a great addition that easily makes Nexus the Armored Core game with the most to do. So if you fall in love with it, it can keep you busy for a long time, between Revolution and replaying Evolution to get missions that you missed. Fuck, now I'm just thinking of how cool it would be if Armored Core 6 got a DLC that was akin to Revolution, remastering a bunch of old missions for Armored Core 6's gameplay. Sadly, Nexus is not the most readily available game. The PlayStation 1 Armored Core games were made available on PS4 and 5 through the Classics program, apparently, and also they have been shockingly re-releasing the mobile games recently. While they're not in English, it is funny that these are the only ones besides Armored Core 6 that you can play on Steam. But ignoring the mobile games again, the classic Armored Core games are kind of a tricky sell, even if I do love some of them. They don't really have the customization options or the complexity or interesting mechanics of later ones. Also, Nexus is the only one of the third-gen games to not get a PSP port, though that would kind of defeat the whole point of it being more approachable with the control scheme. Look, I'd love nothing more than to see a re-release of the entire third generation with better, though maybe not modern, graphics, better menus, and the same classic gameplay and customization. Oh, but maybe they could do like Armored Core 6 did and actually apply units to the stats in your garage screen. But all that's unlikely, so you'll have to rely on the usual methods if you want to play this. Sadly, From Software isn't Capcom. If they were, then classic Armored Core would have been playable on everything from the PS3 generation onward, probably in 1 or 2 huge collections that provide really solid value for money. Look, I don't mean to sound like a Capcom fanboy, but I do genuinely love how for most of their franchises it is very easy to go back and play the older stuff. And you may also be wondering why I'm recommending Nexus and not Last Raven, the actual final PlayStation 2 Armored Core game and the last one to use the classic gameplay style. And I do really like Last Raven, but it doesn't add a lot mechanically. It has a better customization menu mostly, which granted is nice to have, but it's just a nice to have, nothing game-changing. Plus, Last Raven is a pretty difficult game. One of your choices for your first mission is incredibly difficult and basically designed to only be done with a better AC than the one you start with. In part because it is also a game that lets you import your save from the previous game. Nexus doesn't allow that because it changed too much from the early 3rd gen games. So while I don't recommend Last Raven as a starting point, I can absolutely recommend it as a continuation continuation of Nexus once you've exhausted Nexus. So back to you. What do you think of Armored Core Nexus? Are you going to play it? If you've already played it, how do you rate it compared to other Armored Core games? And if you're a longtime fan, let me know if there's some complaints about Nexus that I missed. But for now, this is Mikhail, signing off.